Good afternoon, class. Hope you're doing well. Today we are going to review Chapter 13, Prisons and Jails. And this is a very long chapter. It's not too long, but it's a very good chapter, lots of details, and we're going to be going over a lot of this stuff today that's in the chapter. Make sure you read the chapter and know the terminology of many things that are going to be included for your next exam. And again, we'll highlight some of those terms which you need to know, very basic terms that differentiates jails and prisons. So we will start. And first of all, in early punishments back in the medieval days and before was known as lex talionis, which was basically corporal punishment. And the early punishments that were handed out to people were basically corporal, meaning someone would be touching the other person and not in a good way. So flogging, mutilation, branding was very popular for early punishments because most people thought that if you do something very bad to the person after they committed a crime, they would not commit another crime for fear that they would be flogged, mutilated, or branded again. This type of punishment did coalesce into different types of punishment. Some of it was public humiliation. That was having somebody sit in the stocks where your hands and wrists were bolted down and you stood there and people would come by and throw rotten fruit at you or basically anything in a public square. There were workhouses, and then finally there was exile to a different country. So those are some of the early punishments that began with the doctrine of lex talionis. The emerging of prisons date back to the Middle Ages, and it wasn't until the United States came into play that punishment developed in the late 18th century in the United States that was different from in England and Europe, where we got a lot of our ideas from. So in the United States, there's a lot of different cycles of imprisonization that we did, and it's basically a cycle. So we've tried many different types of punishments in our prison systems, and we're going to go over those cycles. All the way through this, we're always looking for the more humanitarian way to avoid corporal punishment, to not beat somebody, to not brand them, to do something to them that's less physical, but to also change their criminal ways. So we're going to go over the cyclical issues that go on with imprisonization in the United States. So the penitentiary era, and again, these are important to know. You should know the different eras because it'll tell you what type of prisons that we had in the United States. So the penitentiary era, and the word penitentiary comes from the word penance, and the penitentiary was born in Pennsylvania, and it was basically solitary confinement. And the emphasis on these inmates were that they would be in a solitary cell by themselves, and their rehabilitation would be done through penance or reading the Bible and atoning for their sins. So while they're incarcerated in their own cells, solitary confinement, they worked on some sort of handicrafts, whether it be wood or leather. And a couple famous people supported this type of system. And throughout each of these eras that we're going to talk about, crime continued to go up, and something changed with the next era to try to do something about the crime wave that kept going up. So the penitentiary era lasted for quite a long time, but it didn't work. So another system, another era came into play. That was the mass prison era from 1825 to 1876. So due to the high cost of solitary confinement, it abandoned the Pennsylvania model and began what's called the Auburn system, or the Auburn model. And this was a congregant or silent system. So basically, the inmates worked in workshops in groups instead of by themselves in their own cells. And then they would go to their cells alone at night. This, though, the mass prison era at Auburn reintroduced corporal punishment for those that misbehaved. So once again, different era, lasted a few years, did not work. So again, a different era, a different type of rehabilitation comes into play. That was the Reform era, back in 1876. A lot of good things happened back then. And this is basically when parole began. The book does a good job talking about this. And Captain Alexander McConaughey, he invented the mark system in Australia. And Sir Walter Crofton invented the Irish system in Ireland. And it was a series of marks or tickets of leave that an inmate could get for good behavior, and they could go out into the community and work for somebody and stay out there for 2 weeks, a month, 3 months, and be supervised by the person that is employing them. And at some point, they would have so many good marks or tickets of leave, and they had no problems, that they were released from prison. So it was an early release from prison. Very important that you know this, because that's when parole began. And parole began in the United States at the Elmira Reformatory in New York. So this also started indeterminate sentencing, and this was a sentence of 5 to 15 years instead of a straight amount of time. That way, if someone had 5 to 15 years, and after 7 years they've had good behavior, they learned a trade, they could be released early. So again, this era, the reformatory era, emphasized reformation or rehabilitation over punishment. So this was the first time that rehabilitation was looked at in a more practical term. But that didn't work, because crime still occurred. People kept going back in the system. So we're going to try another type of rehabilitation. So another era. And that was the industrial era. And basically, this was where inmates were contracted out to do work, or they would work inside the prison. They would be making materials at a very, 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 very cheap cost. They would be leased to companies, or the companies would come in and have the inmates make these things, whatever it was, sandals, belts, woodwork, whatever. But it was basically this industrial period where the inmates would work for very low wages, but very high profits for the prison. Again, a failed era. This did not work because inmates kept committing crimes once they got out. The recidivism rate was still high. People continued to go to prison. So let's go to the next era. And the punitive era, 1935 to 1945, this was characterized by the belief that inmates owed a debt to society and could only pay it back by a rigorous period of confinement. So they had to do something. So this is when the large prisons were built. Large prisons like in the Shawshank Redemption, that movie. That was the typical big house prison. And they were large fortress-like structures with gun towers, maximum facilities, and they had monotonous daily routines for the inmates, making small rocks out of big rocks. The emphasis was on custody, security, and retribution. So this was not a good time for inmates because they had to work, and it was not easy work. But this didn't last long because recidivism kept going up. Therefore, a new system was needed. So as you can see, so far we've gone through several eras of punishment, and not yet have we found one that stops crime or criminals, so far. Next comes the treatment era, very popular, especially in the 1950s, and it was looked at as the medical model. If someone was sick, then we, or research or prisons, were supposed to fix them. So the emphasis was on rehabilitation through treatment, whether it's drug treatment, counseling treatment, group therapy, whatever it was, they were looked at as patients or clients. So this was a brand new era that something was wrong with somebody and they needed to be fixed medically. This lasted for a little bit, but it still didn't work because the recidivism rate continued to go up. The community-based era, 1967 to 1980, moved away from institutionalized corrections, and basically it emphasized the community corrections and diversion. So basically it wanted to treat people not inside the prison, it wanted to treat people outside. So what they wanted to do is emphasize halfway houses where someone could go to the halfway house, or a work release program, and open institutions where somebody would be incarcerated at night but leave during the day to go into the community to work and be with their family and earn a trade. So again, this era is kind of coming back right now in today's society. But back then it was around for a long time. But what do you think happened? Yes, crime kept going up, recidivism rates were high, and this community-based era did not work. The warehousing era was a very interesting era, and that's when I was involved in corrections. And this was known as the mass imprisonment era. This was due to a lot of research that showed that young kids, especially who are juvenile delinquents, will continue into adulthood and become super predators, and it's going to fill our prison systems with these now adult criminals. So the communities were fed up with crime, especially juvenile crime, and especially in California, we voted to build more prisons because there were not enough. Because the nothing works doctrine came out and rehabilitation was a failure. So you know what? Forget rehabilitation. Let's lock people up and protect the community. So incapacitation was focused on. And if you look at this last bullet down here, in 1980, California had 12 state prisons. Thus began the building of prisons to get tough on crime. And by 1998, there were 32 prisons in California. Just let that sink in for a second. Just think about that. We went from 12 prisons to 32 prisons. My question is, did it help? Did crime go down? Did the recidivism rate continue? Yes, it did. Yes, it did. So even though we built all these prisons, people came, people left, people returned. So again, another era that failed. The just desserts era focuses on the justice model on individual responsibility, sort of return to punishment as a purpose of incarceration, and had some more get tough initiatives, especially taking responsibility for your actions. Okay, this did not really work too well, again, so let's switch to the next era. So right now we have what's called the evidence-based era, and you'll hear this term, especially if you go into corrections. Some of you will be graduating soon at some point, and you'll go into corrections, and you'll hear this a lot, evidence-based corrections. Basically, it applies scientific data and techniques to corrections to determine the best practices of what to do with somebody to help rehabilitate them. And it's supposed to be a very efficient and cost-effective solution to incarcerating somebody. It's going on right now. It works for some, not for all. Recidivism is still high, and there is still crime out there. So in the past 150 years, we've gone through different eras to try to incarcerate people, but really some things have worked for some, but some things don't work for all. So that's the bottom line, is that some things work for some inmates, some do not work for all. So those are the eras. So you should know something about each of those eras, and make sure you read the chapter. They do a good job about going into those with detail. Okay, today, per the book, 1,325 state prisons and 122 federal prisons. It's a lot of prisons. Prisons today, the book talks about the racial disparities amongst African Americans, about black males and black females, and the use of imprisonment varies greatly among states. Different states do different things. Prison facilities vary greatly. In California, we tend to have very large prisons. I don't even think we have a prison that has 500 people. All our prisons are like 3,000 or 4,000. They're huge prisons. Other states have very small prisons with an inmate population, maybe a 500 bed prison. But we have, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 in our prisons that we have now. We have 30 prisons now. We've closed 2. So the average cost for the state, $62 a day. Federal level $87 a day, but California pays over $180 per day for each inmate. That involves programs, food, everything that they need, that they're very well taken care of in our California prisons. Special diets, they have diversion programs. So there's a lot of money being spent. So it's very, very expensive to house an inmate. Overcrowding continues to be a problem. It used to be a big problem back in the 80s and 90s because it led to huge population overcrowding. And California was under federal guidelines to reduce population because the prisons were so crowded in the United States, especially in California. We're going to talk about space available per inmate, how they're confined, living arrangements, and type of housing. Those three things, or those four things right there, dictate how many people can be in a prison. Okay, the book does a good job talking about overcrowding and single versus double bunks. Okay, so the types of prison capacity. So when the prison is rated, that means the number of inmates a prison can handle according to experts. The operational capacity is the number of inmates a prison can accommodate based on appraisal of staff, programs, and services. And finally, the design capacity is the number of inmates a prison was designed to hold. So it's interesting, and some of you will be doing this someday, looking at prison capacities and getting data on this. These numbers should all be the same, but they never are. That's why they're usually overcrowded. They're overcrowded because the design says it can hold 2,000, but operationally it's going to hold 3,000. So again, prison capacity is very important, especially when it comes to overcrowding. Security levels. We're going to have a document and a little thing we're going to do about inmate classification in California specifically, but basically for the book, the security levels of prisons in the United States, of state prisons, are going to be maximum. That's one level. Massive buildings with large populations. Most states have one central maximum security. Most of our prisons have a maximum security wing or area. So most of the prisons in California have a minimum, maximum, and medium areas. Next, we have the medium security. Most prisons in the United States are medium security. They're usually smaller, less secure. Inmates have more freedom, less supervision. And finally, minimum security depends on what level you're at. You could be at minimum security in California and be a level 1. And again, we're going to go over the levels at a different time. And you could be an inmate firefighter. That'd be at a minimum security level where you're not housed in a prison, but you're out in a fire camp. California, in all our prisons, we have multiple levels. We have minimum, maximum, and medium, all in the same prisons. So we do combine the levels. We're going to talk about the classification system and how that works. Basically, an inmate comes into the reception center at one of 2 prisons in California. Within 45 days, they have a meeting with a correctional counselor, and that correctional counselor goes over all the background of the inmate, the crime, where they grew up, education level, medical history, gang history, etc., and talks to the inmate and then assigns them to a classification, whether they're going to be low, medium, maximum, whatever it's going to be. And again, we'll talk about those in a little bit. And the classification system can change if you get in trouble. Your classification can go up. If you're a medium, you're going to be maximum. It can also go down. If you've been a medium classified inmate for a year, you're going to go to a committee that's going to look at your case factors, and they can lessen that. They can take you down a notch, and you can go to minimum, so you can do a lot more things at the minimum facility. So you can move in and out and above and beyond the custody levels, depending on what you do. The goal, though, is to house all inmates in California at the lowest custody level. Lowest custody level. The federal prison system began in 1930. First one was Fort Leavenworth in 1895. And again, the official FBOP or BOP was created in 1930, but they had to have a first federal prison, which was not part of the BOP. BOP came later. So federal prison system has a federal prison in most states. We have 3 in California. The classifications are different in the federal level, different from California. So the federal prison system classifications, there's going to be minimum, low, medium, high, and administrative maximum or ADMAX. So make sure you know a little bit about those and where some of those people are housed in your book. Jails. Jails do a lot of different things. They receive people that are being booked in, those that wait trial, those that are convicted or sentenced and awaiting transfer to prison. These are parole and probation violators, absconders, could be juveniles, mentally ill, and others pending transfer. They hold individuals for the military, protective custody. They hold other individuals for different jurisdictions. They release convicted inmates to the community upon completion of sentence. They transfer to federal, state, and other authorities. They operate community-based programs, electronic monitoring, and they also hold inmates for short terms as they are sentenced. So jails do a lot of different things, okay? And jails are not state facilities, they are county facilities run by the sheriff. Some of you end up working in a jail. Different from a prison, different goal. Per the book, you don't really need to know this, but that's what it looks like as far as jails. So many more people are held in jails in the United States. And the average cost is about $14,000 a year per inmate. Not very much. Typical jail inmate. And again, this is an old stat. So unmarried black male between 25 to 34 years old with some high school education. Not sure if that's correct as of today, right now, across the United States, but that's what the book says. Most jails are small and designed to hold less than 50 inmates. 6% of the jails in the United States hold over 50% of the prisoners. And talk about mega jails like Los Angeles. County jail is gigantic. New York City is gigantic. Chicago is gigantic. So mega jails are huge. They hold thousands of people. So they're like prisons, but they're jails. Women in jail. Women make up about 15% of jail population. Largest growth in the United States is females. They have some special problems that need to be looked at. There's not a good or a universal classification system for women that are used. Lack of facilities geared for female offenders, and education levels are low. Some other issues is that there's drug abuse, pregnancy, child support issues going on. So there's a different type of issue that goes on with females rather than males in jail. Women working in corrections, 22% of correctional officers are women. When I worked for the Department of Corrections, I worked with females all the time. So they're almost, I would say it's more percent in California than right there. And it depends on who you talk to, but CDCR does a great job of hiring anybody. Again, male, female, black, white, green, doesn't matter. High school diploma, you can write your name, you can think clearly, make good decisions, you'll have a job as a correctional officer. Growth of jails, usually per the book, they're about 84% of rated capacity, so they're not overcrowded, but some are extremely overcrowded. Many inmates are held in jails because of prison overcrowding, so you can't transfer somebody to prison because the prison's overcrowded, so you keep them in jail. So that's why there's a lot of diversion right now from jails to community-based programs that can maintain that large jail population. New generation jails, you need to read about that. There's different types of jails that are out there now. There's pods, there's direct supervision, there's indirect supervision. And if you ever watch any TV shows about jails, they have some visuals about direct supervision and indirect supervision jails and how they're better than the linear jails, which are more dangerous for staff. The future has always been, or should have always been, teach an inmate a marketable skill or vocation so they can get out and into the community and do something with their skills. State standards for male management. I don't know why they're talking about male management, but the future with jails is that they're going to continue to be around, and something needs to be done to ensure that you teach an inmate a skill. In California, in the prison system, the main goal is to get an inmate his GED, help them get his GED, because a high school diploma is one of the things that most people need. That's very basic. So that's what the future is for the Department of Corrections with prisons, but jails, it's teaching the inmates a marketable skill. Private prisons, book talks about private prisons. We've closed those. The governor's closed those in California. We've had those for many years. They're cheaper. They're operated by private firms. Costs a lot of money, but it does save money in the end. But some states are getting rid of those for various political reasons. Okay, that is chapter 13. And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and put that on the discussion board or let me know. Make sure you read this chapter and look at the terminology that we've gone over. All right, have a great day. Talk to you again.